Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today, I continue bringing you the next chapter in the story of Hoài and Officer Hùng, a story that grows more suffocating and frightening the deeper we go. In the previous episode, Hùng was forced to step in and take responsibility for a debt of over 100 million that his mother had left behind. At first, it was just a number, one that Hùng believed he could somehow manage, endure, and carry in silence. But reality quickly proved otherwise. Interest bred more interest, leaving no room for correction. In a short amount of time, the debt grew day by day, hour by hour, like a bottomless pit. The lenders gave Hùng no chance to breathe. They called relentlessly, one number after another, day and night. Sometimes, before he could even set his phone down after ending one call, the screen would light up again. And it didn't stop with phone calls. They began to appear, outside the gate of Hùng workplace, along the roads he traveled every day, and eventually, they even came looking for Hoài. The fragile piece of that small family was slowly crushed. Meals were no longer shared in warmth, everyday conversations gradually disappeared, replaced by heavy silence and anxious glances that dared not be spoken aloud. As this episode begins, things no longer remain at the level of mere threats. From the moment Hùng officially took the debt under his name, his phone was almost never quiet. The familiar vibration became so triggering that just hearing it made his heart tighten. There were calls where, the moment he hung up and hadn't yet caught a full breath, another number would already appear. The voice on the other end never needed to shout or raise its tone. On the contrary, it was calm, slow, and chillingly cold. Each sentence was like a thin blade, not drawing blood immediately, but slowly slicing into the listener's nerves. More than anyone, Hùng understood that this kind of calm was far more terrifying than open threats. It showed that the people on the other side were absolutely certain he had no way out. And it wasn't only Hùng. Hoài also began to clearly sense the danger closing in. One afternoon, as she was walking Tony home from school, the familiar alley suddenly felt different. At the entrance stood two unfamiliar men leaning against a vehicle, their eyes fixed on her and her child. They said nothing and didn't approach, but their gaze followed every step she took, sending a chill straight down her spine. She tightened her grip on Tony's hand and walked faster than usual. Her mind raced with thoughts, but she didn't dare turn around. A single glance in the reflection of a parked car was enough for her to understand. Her family had been marked. This was no coincidence. From that day on, Hoài no longer felt safe, not even inside her own home. Every small sound outside the gate, every unfamiliar noise in the middle of the night made her flinch. She tried to act normal in front of Hùng, in front of Tony, but the fear continued to grow, quietly gnawing away at her from the inside. From that day on, Hùng almost never dared to come home early. It wasn't because of work, and it wasn't because he wanted to avoid Hoài. It was simply that every time he thought about the door to his own house, his heart grew unbearably heavy. He feared the moment he would step inside and see faces that had no right to be there. He feared the look in Hoài eyes when she realized just how deeply he was being dragged into this bottomless mire. Hùng knew it clearly, the loan sharks had begun to make their real move. There were no more scattered late-night calls, no more vague hints or veiled threats. This time, they were no longer testing him. They acted directly, openly, without hiding, without avoidance. They appeared right in front of Hoài house. In broad daylight. In the middle of the familiar neighborhood. They didn't need to shout or threaten. Just standing there was enough to make it clear, they had already claimed this house as part of their game. That day, Hoài returned from the market as usual. In her hands were bags of vegetables still damp with water, her mind occupied with thoughts of dinner and why Hùng had been coming home unusually late. She opened the door and froze. Inside the house, two unfamiliar men were already sitting there. The door was shut. The curtains were drawn. The air was so thick it felt impossible to breathe. Hoài stood motionless for several seconds. A cold chill ran straight down her spine, spreading quickly to her fingertips. She didn't need to ask who they were. Their gaze wasn't aggressive, but it was the kind that made it impossible to turn away and leave. Hùng arrived shortly after. One look at the scene before him was enough for him to understand that everything had crossed the final line. His heart pounded so hard his ears rang. He forced himself to stay calm, to appear as though he still had control, even as his thoughts descended into chaos. There were no greetings. No small talk. One of the men pushed a piece of paper toward Hùng. The paper was placed on the table lightly, yet it felt unbearably heavy. It wasn't a new loan agreement. It wasn't the interest contract he had seen before. It was a commitment form, an agreement stating that he would take over his mother's debt. A short, clear line of text. No need for explanation. But that very brevity was enough to bind him to a debt with no escape. Hùng stared at the words, his throat dry and burning. Each letter felt like it was carving an invisible wound deeper into him. Then a voice spoke, cold and decisive. If you don't sign, your mother won't be coming back. No further threats were needed. No raised voice. That single sentence erased every remaining option. Hùng went numb. In his mind flashed the image of his mother, a frail woman, forever weighed down by guilt for dragging her son into this tragedy. He knew then, this was no longer about money. This was a gamble he was not allowed to lose. His hand trembled as he picked up the pen. A wave of helplessness surged through him, tightening his chest until it ached. As a police officer, he understood better than anyone what this piece of paper meant. One signature was enough to send his life down a path with no return. Hoài stood beside him, her entire body cold. She looked at Hùng, at the paper, then at the pen in his hand. More than anyone, she understood, if he signed, he would never be able to hold his head high again. Not just because of the debt, but because of his honor and his future. But if he didn't sign, his mother would not survive. No one urged him on. No one rushed him. The silence in the room crushed every breath. Hùng closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if gathering the last scraps of courage he had left. Then he signed. The handwriting shook. The signature was no longer steady. The moment the pen lifted from the paper, Hùng felt it clearly. Something inside him had just collapsed. The two men stood up. Before leaving, one of them turned back, looked straight at Hùng, and said a single sentence in a frighteningly calm tone. 3 days. Full payment. Or don't blame us. The door closed. The house sank into silence. Hùng ran everywhere. Those 3 days stretched before him like an entire month. From early morning, he left the house and went from place to place, carrying a fragile hope that if just one door opened, he might be able to pull himself and his family out of this deep pit. But reality was colder than anything he had imagined. The banks refused him. His application files were returned after only a few minutes of review. The responses were polite, professional, and entirely procedural, yet left no room for compassion. Insufficient income. Existing liabilities. High risk. Every reason was logical, so reasonable that he couldn't argue against a single one. Friends avoided him. Some didn't answer their phones. Some read his messages but never replied. Others agreed to meet, then skillfully found excuses to postpone. Hùng didn't blame them. He understood, the moment money and debt were mentioned, people feared being dragged into trouble. But understanding didn't make it hurt any less. The high-interest lenders he turned to next were even more terrifying than the first group. The numbers were spoken calmly, as if they were nothing more than simple calculations. But to Hùng, they were tightening nooses. He realized that if he took even one more step down that path, he would never escape. He hadn't finished carrying the old debt, and now another weight threatened to fall on his shoulders. Every number in his head piled on top of the next, with no end in sight. Hùng felt as though he were standing inside a sealed maze. The more he ran, the more walls he hit. Each evening when he returned home, he simply sat in silence. He didn't speak. He didn't eat. Hoài placed a bowl of rice in front of him, but he barely seemed to see it. His eyes were empty, fixed on some distant, invisible point. She didn't dare ask questions, nor did she push him. She only sat beside him in silence, though her worry showed in every small movement. The first day passed heavily. On the second day, the pressure felt as though it were crushing his chest. And the third day came faster than he expected. That evening, Hùng finished work late. The tasks dragged on, his mind exhausted, yet he forced himself to keep going, as if staying busy a little longer could push the terrifying thoughts further away. When he left the station, night had fully fallen. The streets were quieter than usual, yellow streetlights stretching distorted shadows across the road. On the familiar path leading home, just as he turned into a narrow alley, everything happened too fast. A sudden blow struck him from behind. Before Hùng could react, he was thrown to the ground. Sharp pain shot straight to his head, his vision going dark. He tried to push himself up, but the next strike knocked him completely off balance. Blurred figures surrounded him. They didn't say much. They just hit him. The blows were decisive and precise. They struck exactly where they intended, enough to leave him numb with pain, enough to drive fear deep into his flesh, but not enough to kill. In a brief moment between waves of agony, Hùng realized it clearly. They knew exactly what they were doing. Amid heavy breathing and the dull sounds of impact, a cold voice rang out. Just a warning. Another voice followed, unhurried. Next time won't be this light. Then it ended as quickly as it had begun. Footsteps faded away, leaving behind an empty alley and a body curled on the cold pavement. Hùng tried to move, but his body refused to obey. Every breath was heavy, his throat burning dry. He lay there in the familiar alley, one that had never felt so foreign. After a while, someone passed by. At first, it was just a hesitant glance, then they stopped when they saw Hùng couldn't stand on his own. They called for help and took him to the nearest medical clinic. The white lights made his eyes ache. A doctor examined him, treated his injuries, and carefully bandaged the wounds. Questions were asked, but Hùng answered briefly, avoiding the probing looks. The doctor advised him to stay for observation. At least overnight. Hùng shook his head. He didn't want anyone to know. He didn't want his colleagues to find out. He didn't want Hoài to panic. He didn't want the situation to spiral even further beyond control. He put his jacket back on, covering the bruises that still throbbed beneath the fabric. When he stepped outside, the night was deeper, the cold wind cutting through him and making his body tremble. Hùng understood very clearly. This was not the end. And whatever awaited him ahead would be far heavier than anything he had already endured. That night, Hùng came home very late. The moment the door opened, the light inside the room was enough for Hoài to clearly see the clothes he was wearing. Dried blood stains, dark, patchy, spread across his shirt and sleeves. Not so much that it was shocking at first glance, but more than enough to make her heart drop straight to the bottom. Hoài froze. In that instant, all surrounding sounds seemed to disappear. She stood there, unable to say a word, watching Hung step inside with a heavy gait, his shoulders slumped, as if every step carried an invisible weight dragging him down. What happened to you? Her voice trembled before the question was even fully formed. Hung didn't answer right away. He simply lowered his head and gently closed the door behind him, as if afraid of making noise, even though there were only the two of them in the house. Hoài moved closer. When she reached out and touched his arm, her hand stopped midair. Bruises were clearly visible beneath the fabric. Some were swollen, others already changing color. Her hands shook as she carefully traced each injury, as though even the slightest pressure might cause him more pain. What happened to you? This time, the question was barely a whisper. Hung tried to pull the corner of his mouth into a smile, a crooked, forced smile, so strained that even he could feel the helplessness in it. He was about to say he was fine, that it was just a small accident. But the moment he met Hoài reddened eyes, every bit of composure he had been holding on to completely collapsed. He lowered his head. His shoulders began to tremble. And then Hung broke down. It wasn't loud sobbing, nor was it choking gasps. It was broken breathing held tight in his chest, silent tears falling one after another, as if he had suppressed everything for far too long and now had no strength left to pretend. He cried like a child who had been pushed to the very end. "It's my mother's fault." His voice cracked, breaking apart. "If it weren't for her, I wouldn't have dragged you into this." Every word came out heavy, as if he were condemning himself. Hung didn't dare lift his head. He was afraid to look into Hoài eyes, afraid of seeing blame, regret, or worst of all, despair. Hoài said nothing. She stepped closer and wrapped her arms around him. No hesitation. No pause. She held him tightly, as if letting go would cause the man in front of her to disappear. She could feel his body shaking in her embrace, each ragged breath, each wave of pain he was trying to hide. She didn't blame him. She didn't ask another question. In that moment, Hoài understood one thing with absolute clarity: Hung had pushed himself to his final limit. There was nowhere left for him to retreat. For the first time, her fear was no longer vague. It became sharp, unmistakable, almost cruel in its clarity. If things continued this way, Hung would not survive. Not only because of the loan sharks, but because he himself was being worn down day by day, both physically and mentally. She helped him into the bedroom and laid him down. When Hung finally drifted off from sheer exhaustion, his breathing heavy but gradually steady, Hoài pulled the blanket over him, carefully, as if afraid of waking him. The warm yellow light revealed the deep fatigue on his face, the bruises that hadn't yet faded. Hoài sat down at the edge of the bed. For a long time. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. Her tears had already run dry. What filled her mind now was no longer a blurry fear, but a cold, frightening clarity. She looked at Hung, at every injury on his body, and the images of the past days replayed one by one, the phone calls, the watching eyes, the threats that never needed to be spoken aloud. Everything was tightening. In her mind, there was only one thought, so clear it left no room for escape. This had to end. No matter the cost. Hoài knew very well that there was no safe choice. She also understood that the path forming in her mind would not be easy. It could take everything she had, her house, her peaceful life, even the future she once believed would be stable. But if she didn't act, she would lose Hung. That thought tightened her chest. She quietly clenched her hands, forcing herself to stay even more alert. In the silence of the late night, Hoài slowly began to picture a way. A way that, if taken, could cost her everything. But if not taken, the man she loved most in the world would have no chance to stand up again. Hoài eyes darkened. And that night, she did not sleep. Hoài did not choose the safe way. That decision did not come from a moment of impulsiveness, nor from ignorance of the consequences. On the contrary, it was the result of an entire night spent in a numb, relentless clarity, a night in which she had thought through every worst-case scenario, weighed them carefully, and placed them against one single thing: Hung's life. The next morning, just as the sky began to lighten, inside the small house, the air was still heavy after a night of almost no sleep. Hung lay on the bed, his body drained by pain, exhaustion pulling him into a state somewhere between consciousness and sleep. His breathing was uneven, sweat still beading on his forehead, the bruises on his body far from fading. Hoài stood beside the bed for a long time. She looked at him, really looked, as if trying to carve this image into her memory. The man in front of her was no longer the strong police officer she had known at the beginning. He was being worn down piece by burdens he never should have had to carry. She turned away and moved quietly, afraid that even the smallest sound might wake him. In another room, Hoài opened the cabinet and took out every important document she owned. She arranged them neatly. Her hands did not tremble, but her heart beat slowly and heavily. Each piece of paper she picked up was tied to a part of the life she had worked so hard to protect. She knew very well that once she carried them out of the house in this way, there was no guarantee they would ever return unchanged. Before leaving, Hoài stopped at the door one last time. She looked toward the bedroom, where Hung still lay motionless. A flicker of hesitation passed through her, not because she was afraid, but because she understood that once she stepped past this door, everything would change. She gently closed the door. She left no note. She did not wake him. Hoài knew clearly that if she continued waiting for Hung to find a way out, he would not survive it. The past 3 days had been enough to show her his limit. The loan sharks would not stop. They had already started using violence, and the next time would not be just a warning. No one needed to tell her, they could take his life at any moment. That was why Hoài decided to step into the vortex herself. Not with blind recklessness, but with a conscious choice, to put herself forward, and pull Hung behind her. She accepted becoming the one to face them, the one to be watched, threatened, pressured, as long as Hung was no longer their direct target. Hoài understood that those people did not care about right or wrong. They cared only about what they wanted. And if she appeared as someone willing to resolve the matter, willing to take responsibility, there was a chance Hung would be temporarily released from their grip. But she also understood something equally terrifying. One wrong step, and not only Hung, but this entire family, would have no way back. Every step Hoài took away from the familiar alley felt unbearably heavy. She did not turn around. Not because she felt no attachment, but because she knew that if she did, she would no longer have the courage to continue. At this moment, her mind was no longer filled with the chaotic fear of previous days. In its place was a calm so cold it was frightening. She was walking into a world where she did not control the rules, knowing only that if she hesitated, everything would collapse even faster. Hoài chose to trade away her own peace. She chose to become the one who bore the risk. Not because she believed herself stronger than Hung, but because she knew he no longer had the strength to endure another blow, either physically or emotionally. And yet, even after making that decision, one question quietly surfaced in her mind, impossible to erase. Would this reckless choice truly save Hung? Or would it open the door to a new tragedy, far more brutal than anything they had endured before? Hoài had no answer. And she knew that from this moment on, nothing would ever be simple again. Stay tuned for the next episode.
Xin chào tất cả mọi người, giờ thì mình đang làm video nha. Cảm ơn mọi người vì đã theo dõi và ủng hộ cho kênh của mình nhé. Tạm biệt mọi người.